The American legend starts with a ship as the Roman legend did. The Mayflower, like the ship Aeneas sailed, came from a distant eastern strand. Its crew turned their backs on a brilliant civilization to pioneer in a barbarous western land. Although the Mayflower was a documented historical fact, therefore even more, perhaps less than mythical, she has long ago achieved mythical significance because she bore a saving remnant from a burning city. A crew of God-fearing, honest, energetic men, armed with weapons no unfriendly native could long hope to withstand. Or, shifting to the Romulus myth, the founders of British America, themselves refugees, and for religious reasons, citizens of a besieged city, founded a new city. And the new city welcomed to its shores other refugees, and eventually even deported robbers. The new city grew, of course, at the expense of its new neighbors, for it was land hungry. The saving remnant from wicked Europe had to work hard and fight hard. Like the citizens of the young Roman Republic, it increased and multiplied, and its land hunger grew insatiably. Unlike the Romans, it did not face peoples somewhat equal to itself, but savages who lived largely by hunting and to some extent by primitive agriculture. The land was no paltry Italy, but a huge continent. The elect took it partly by purchase, but mainly by force, by pitched battle, by ambush, by massacre, and by broken treaty. The conquerors were too few to exploit fully all of this broad land. They tried to enslave the natives, as the Spanish had done in the South, but the natives proved intractable. So they brought in slaves from distant Africa, many of them prisoners of war, like the slaves the Romans captured or bought, and they drove their black slaves hard. They bought in indentured servants from Europe. They pushed the French colonists aside. They pushed the British crown out. They pushed the Spanish aside. They purchased the vast Louisiana territory, pushed Mexico aside, and reached for the Pacific. And always they pushed the Indian aside. They were angry when he fought back. They muttered that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, a premature declaration of our own century's crime of genocide. Meanwhile, they flogged their slaves, as the Romans had also done. Since labor remained in short supply, they welcomed contract labor, chiefly from Europe. And while the governing class of Europe looked down upon this incredible, energetic, greedy, and violent new nation as a people descended from the scum of Europe, the new nation stuck to its story that it was a saving remnant guided by God to found a new city, a city that finally stretched from sea to shining sea. Its citizens proudly claimed descent from those Europeans who had had enough guts and gumption and enough faith in God to leave Europe, to the pampered, the tyrannical, the lazy, to the competent, the immoral, and to those who, when the Ark or the Mayflower or later the liners sailed, had not enough sense to come in out of the rain. Those who had come, no matter when, remained the elect, as was clearly proven by the incredible success of the whole enterprise. The American was the new man. The promised land was his. Had he not fought for it and killed for it and seen his neighbor killed for it? In 1752, an Englishman, Bishop Berkeley, had written a poem on the prospect of planting arts and learning in America, in which he announced that westward the course of empire paves its way. Precisely 50 years later, an American, John Quincy Adams, delivered, approximately in Plymouth, Massachusetts, an oration in which he suggested that the empire was guided from heaven itself. Westward, the star of empire paves the way. It had been precisely by following the stars westward that the Mayflower had reached Plymouth Rock. The phrase Star of Empire, like the later phrase Manifest Destiny, argued that America was not imperialistic or aggressive like Western Europe, but that it naturally expanded because America was God's country and were as pious as Aeneas had been. Since America was the land where men drawn from every continent and from most of the nations on earth had left the lands that had rejected and oppressed them, they had come to America and had been granted equal citizenship with Native Americans and had in many cases grown wealthy. How could anybody accuse them of the nationalistic racism that afflicted imperialistic Europeans? Americans were merely the successful relatives of those to whom, in hundreds of thousands of cases, they mailed home a monthly remittance. By an apparent paradox, Europeans of all classes, including those who enjoy little political or economic freedom, seem to have more sense of play than Americans and to be somehow younger than the people of this young country, and to look on Americans as melancholy optimists, men with faith in the future, but somehow bored with the present, and hence nervous, driven, consumed with cura, anxious to make money. An American president would one day sagely detect and blandly announce that the business of America was business. Indeed, the America had a truly Roman desire for money. Money gave him what it gave the Romans: power over all men, the chance of achieving status through conspicuous consumption or public benefaction, and the admiration and show of friendship that his loneliness sorely needed. Anxiety, or cura, Erich Fromm suggests, is not the American's only affliction. His other chief maladies are boredom and loneliness. Dr. Fromm further suggests that these three afflictions would be less destructive if the American were only conscious that he was anxious, lonely, and bored. It is curious that the Roman, too, clearly suffered from the same three afflictions. Curious that, like his future counterpart, he turned all three maladies into a drive for power. The land the Americans seized was not only larger than Italy, Spain, and Gaul. It yielded more wealth to farmer and miner alike. Its primitive natives were more easily conquered. The Atlantic, even with improved navigation, was a safer shield against interference from more highly civilized great powers to the east than the Adriatic Sea had been for the Roman Republic. The American people were therefore not toughened by such a disciplined use of successful violence as were the early Roman republics. On the other hand, the empty stretches of land created their own school of violence. The lawless frontier of the desperado and vigilante of shooting from the hip, the frontier that Hollywood still celebrates. Frontier living fostered a disrespect for law and even for human life. Although it often taught men to cooperate and organize, it subjected men to loneliness. It invited activism and voluntarism, two of the Roman Republic's outstanding characteristics. And in neither case did these characteristics stimulate man's curious power of attentive listening, of receptiveness, a power that takes many forms: religious meditation, moral self-criticism, philosophic contemplation and speculation, artistic apprehension and inspiration, the mutual revelations of the friendship that respects privacy, and finally, the rigorous dialect that sounds to its uninitiated like quarreling, but that of it is aimed at mutual discovery, not at one-sided victory. I'm going to read that again. In neither case did these characteristics stimulate man's curious power of attentive listening, of receptiveness, of religious meditation, of moral self-criticism, of philosophic contemplation, of speculation, of artistic apprehension, or inspiration. In matters of law, activism and voluntarism can easily discourage the search for justice and the common good, and encourage litigious in the courtroom and legal coercion in the legislative chamber. They tend towards winning cycles and making a law against it. For unguided by the power of listening, except to catch the opponent off guard, they are rooted in arrogance, self-assertion, and violence. In the empire the Roman Republic constructed between 227 BC, when it made Sicily its first province, and the formalization exactly 2 centuries later of Augustus' failed military autocracy combat by trial at law, had been substituted for a succession of civil wars in America. In America, the centuries of violence that cheapened human life saw the American burn off the forest land, rape the soil that could have been husbanded, tear open grasslands to destructive winds, plow up hillsides from which rain promptly washed away the topsoil, convert the enormous national capital of a young nation into quick private profits. In the process, the American learned, or thought he learned, not only that the competition of private interest was the quickest route to the general welfare, but that ecology and a sense of context could be safely ignored, and that when tough-minded men could no longer shoot or hire gangsters to shoot, legislatures could be bought. When those methods failed, private interest could fight it out in court. By 1898, the Society of Rough Riders could pick a dubious quarrel with Spain, seize most of the remnants of the Spanish colonial empire, and still remain sincerely convinced that America was not imperialistic. Makes me sick. 4. Is the American century likely to lead where Roman century of Augustus led? Even earlier than Augustus, Polybius had set himself the task of explaining to the Greek world the meteoric rise of a small republic in the West to master the Mediterranean world. Now that the American Republic has expanded from its original 13 sparsely settled states to its present status as the heaviest armed and richest society on earth, perhaps emitting what Arnold Toynbee would call the most powerful cultural radiations of any society on earth, what is our future political development likely to be? Will the military-industrial complex against which President Eisenhower warned us evolve into Caesarism? This brief discussion has focused on analogies between our own cultural experiences and those of the Roman Republic, but there have also been, of course, great and obvious differences. Our polity remains democratic, even granted the oligarchic pressures of the military-industrial complex. Our technology races ahead at unprecedented speed and seems to promise the end of poverty, disease, and ignorance for the first time in man's long and hungry history. The religion professed by the majority of Americans is drawn from the teachings of a man who practiced nonviolence and taught nonviolence. He also warned, as the other Hebrew prophets warned, against trying to worship God and money simultaneously. Unhappily, democratic institutions and political freedoms cannot survive without discussion, criticism, and deliberation, without, in short, dialogue, and these have not flourished widely in the post-war years. It is rhetoric, not logic, that has characterized recent political dialogue. As for technology, that is morally neutral. It can be geared to obliterating life on Earth as easy as it can to benefiting man, perhaps more easily. As our post-war successive national budgets demonstrate, as for Christianity, is there any other of Christ's precepts that so few Christians have heeded? What happens historically will obviously depend less on whether political speakers speak under God or as to whether our actions follow the teachings that we claim God gave us. Jesus himself, he isn't, but he's on record as observing that many have ears that hear not. History since his day has more than justified the acuteness of this observation. In 1955, while discussing foreign affairs in Godwin lectures at Harvard, Adlai Stevenson remarked wittily, but also perhaps wistfully, "I sometimes think that what America needs more than anything else is a hearing aid." Let us assume that our swift, successful rise to world power confirms us, as a less swift rise once confirmed Rome, in believing that force is not the ultima ratio, but the principal ratio, that only sure tools for persuading are the stick and the carrot for donkeys, gunfire, and money for men, and that the job of the Marine Corps is to kill, as our television commentators sorrowfully disclose, and not to help cause the enemy to lay down his weapons, even though precious lives on both sides will be lost in the process of causing this. That our diplomacy should be total rather than intelligible to the opinion of mankind, or anyhow to that of our best friends. That outside the government, the art of deliberation is not possible, and that therefore the knowledgeable manipulation of opinion and popular passions must save us. That its force fails to root foreign foes and to quell domestic riots. We can certainly win by increasing the dosage of what has failed to date. This is the sort of belief in force that the Roman Republic acquired from its rise to unique power, and certain things followed for the Romans that suggest cause and effect. Augustus massacred his opponents, confiscated their property, and hired more soldiers, helped Antony to conquer the Senate, conquered most of his foreign foes, conquered Antony, held down his domestic foes, and held off his remaining foreign foes. But in the process, the imperial army eventually learned an interesting lesson, that Augustus' successors to the crown could be overthrown by fighting a would-be usurper. The usurper, if successful, deemed it wise to make a donative to his troops and frequently to raise their wages. Genuine political life, except for local and oligarchic rule in the city-states that together composed the empire, had lost its meaning. The rich were in any case busy enjoying life. The poor were ignorant, lethargic, and parasitical. Informers were everywhere, and nearly any intelligent political critic was likely to be punished as subversive. The population of the empire had little reason to defend the regime against coups d'etat that changed nothing, except when civil wars exposed the civilization to the devastation of his land, or the extortion of his money, or the rough soldiery of the emperor of the usurper. In the late Republic, war, civil or foreign, had offered the submerged poor a way to gain a livelihood. In the empire, one of the most lucrative careers for the poor man was to help successful usurpers conquer that empire. Indeed, such careers were so lucrative that sometimes the soldiery forced a general to rebel and seize power. In a sense, therefore, the empire was conquered many times before it fell. The armies were composed mostly of native sons, but increasingly mercenaries from the barbarous tribes it was holding off, or the barbarians became its heavily fortified frontier instead of enlisting the imperial army that might merely threaten the frontier, until the emperor made them annual gifts. gifts that were in fact bribes to keep them from starting a war. In a sense, then, the barbarians that surrounded the empire were living off the civilians inside it without the formality of conquering them and without the empire suffering the conveniences of falling. Patriotism could not be called on to prevent these subtle disguised forms of conquest because the empire was decreasingly loved by his subjects and was in fact decreasingly worth dying for. A population was in fact decreasingly worth dying for. I'll say that again. A population already basically governed by force that was in no mood to prevent somebody else than the empire from governed by force. In 166 AD, remember that date, Marcus Aurelius, the last of the Antonines, was struggling against invasions, attempted invasions, and famine. A Roman army brought back a severe plague from a campaign against a Parthian empire. In the 105 years that followed the death of Marcus Aurelius, 32 emperors resigned. Only 2 died a natural death. 9, maybe 10 were murdered by their own soldiers. 17 were chosen by soldiers who in one case auctioned off the right to rule. During the 238 AD, 6 emperors ruled. Roman law never evolved a workable rule for choosing the emperor. Yet it was during this appalling century, racked by civil war over the imperial succession and by guerrilla insurrections, that Roman jurisprudence reached its golden age with Papian, Paul, and Oppian. 2 of these came from the Greek East. For beginning with the 12 tablets in 443 BC, Rome's successive efforts at codification drew heavily on the laws and legal experience of the Hellenistic world, just as her legal thought was suffused with the philosophy of Greek Stoics taught to many of her governing class. But it was Rome, not Greece, that had subjected the Mediterranean world and faced the problem of harmonizing its many legal systems, whether tribal law in Spain or the ancient and sophisticated legal systems of Greece, Syria, or Egypt. It was Rome that had to administer the affairs of a world under law. Invasions, imperial usurpers, civil war, extortion by officials who were increasingly soldiers, devastated farmlands, famines, plagues. That famine helped to spread among a physically weakened and demoralized population, and a partial spiritual succession by the growing Christian community and its fellow travelers further weakened the fabric of society. In 284, an able, if half-civilized professional soldier, Diocletian, seized the throne and desperately tried to save the empire by augmenting the use of force. He increased the army, punished those who refused to accept deflated coin, and enforced fixed prices to fight inflation. He legally forbade officials to desert their posts, tradesmen their trades, peasants the land they worked. He persecuted Christians. 21 years later, he abdicated in despair and approximately retired to a palace that was built like a huge fortress, where he amused himself by raising cabbage. There were more civil wars. By 324, Constantine had conquered all rivals, had embraced Christianity, and become an emperor. Having built Constantinople as the second Rome, he chose to reign there and rarely visited first Rome. And during the following decades, the Greek half of the empire, which the Roman Republic had conquered, concentrated on defending itself and allowed the less wealthy, less civilized Latin half to be overrun by barbarian tribes. In 410, Rome, the source of law and empire, was sacked by the Visigoths. A later temporary restoration of her power could only fail. She left a rich legacy of law for others to adapt to their needs. She left magnificent military roads which fell into disuse in the Latin West. There's no proof that American power need follow Roman power to the bitter end, even though Thucydides may be right in holding that, as to the past, the future, in the course of human things, must resemble if it does not reflect it. Great human power has ended many times, and customarily after placing most of its faith in the efficacy of force. Of course, regardless of the cause of Rome's fall, the Greek god Hermes may really have said about civilizations what Lucian of Samosata reported him as saying. Cities, my friends, die just like men. We do not need to consult the ancient Romans to find out whether, unlike what they implied by phrases, Roma Eterna and the immense majesty of the Pax Romana, our Western civilization is a city that will never die. But perhaps we can, with great profit, consult the Roman Empire on the relation between the free world and the degree to which it chooses to rely on force, either through domestic dictatorships or through military interventions. For perhaps Thucydides would agree that implicitly history is always a conversation between the present and the past.